I'd been a Lewis County search and rescue volunteer for 11 years when I stopped walking Trail 267. I need to be clear about what that means. I'm not a ranger. I'm not law enforcement. I work at a hardware store in Randall 5 days a week and spend my weekends doing the thing I've done since I was 23, helping find people who get lost in the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest. I'm a ground searcher. I carry a pack, a radio, a GPS unit, and a level of physical fitness that has gotten harder to maintain every year since I turned 30. I've been on somewhere around 60 missions. Most of them ended well. Some didn't. One changed the way I think about a particular piece of country south of here. And that's the one I need to talk about. If you're someone who spends time in backcountry, and you appreciate hearing these things told honestly without the parts that make for good campfire stories but lousy truth, then this is the right channel for you. Ashwarden Horror is where I agreed to tell this, and I'd encourage you to subscribe if that kind of careful, honest account is something you value. Because what I'm about to describe deserves that. The trail I'm talking about is not on the current forest map. It was on the 2012 map. It was on the 2006 map. By the time the Gifford-Pinchot started its Sustainable Trails Review, it had already been functionally gone for years, overgrown, blow-down choked, drainage crossings washed out. The Forest Service didn't remove it because of anything that happened. They removed it because no one maintained it and the tread disappeared. That's how trails die in Western Washington. It's not dramatic. The forest just takes them back. Trail 267. And I'm calling it that because that's what the number was, ran roughly 4.5 miles from a spur off Forest Road 2329, south of the Cispus River, up through a second-growth drainage and onto a bench that connected with an older path leading toward the Dark Meadows area. The lower section crossed 2 unnamed tributaries. The upper section gained a ridge through a Douglas fir stand that had been logged in the 1950s and replanted in the 1960s. There was nothing remarkable about it. It was one of dozens of short connector trails built during the CCC era or shortly after, designed to link the road system to higher elevation routes that seasonal rangers used for patrol and fire lookout access. I first walked it in 2015. I walked it because a 14-year-old kid from Olympia had gotten separated from his family on a day hike near Blue Lake Creek. And the search area included the drainage below the old 267 tread. That was a Tuesday in August. The kid was found the next morning, 1.5 miles north of where he'd last been seen. Cold and dehydrated, but fine. Standard outcome. I didn't think about Trail 267 again for almost a year. The second time was June 2016. A 61-year-old mushroom picker hadn't returned to his vehicle at a pullout on Forest Road 23. The Lewis County Sheriff's Office activated SAR, and our team was assigned a sector that overlapped the lower portion of 267. I was paired with a woman named Denise Kowalski, who'd been volunteering longer than I had. Denise was thorough. She didn't rush. She kept her intervals clean and her radio calls on time. We worked the drainage from about 0700 to 1400, found no sign of the subject, and were reassigned to a different sector. The mushroom picker walked out on his own the following morning from a completely different direction. What I remember from that day, and I wrote it in my after-action notes because it struck me as unusual, was that Denise stopped about 2/3 of the way up the old 267 tread and said she didn't want to go further. I asked her why. She said the drainage felt wrong. That was the word she used. Wrong. I'd known Denise for 6 years at that point. She wasn't the kind of person who said things like that. She once helped carry a deceased hiker down 3 miles of switchback in the rain without changing her tone of voice. She was the most composed volunteer I'd ever worked with. When she said the drainage felt wrong, I didn't argue. I marked our turnaround point on the GPS, radioed it in, and we worked back down. The search coordinator didn't question it. There were 12 other teams out that day, and our sector had been low probability from the start. I thought about it afterward, though. Not in any serious way. The way you think about a moment that doesn't fit the person who produced it. Denise and I never discussed it again, and I assumed it was fatigue or a bad night's sleep or the kind of vague backcountry intuition that experienced people sometimes develop and don't need to justify. Then came October 2017. A solo backpacker, 38 years old, male from Portland, had registered for a 3-night trip along the Boundary Trail and hadn't checked in at his planned exit point. He was 2 days overdue. The initial search focused on the Boundary Trail corridor between Elk Pass and Bear Meadow, but by day 3, the probability area had expanded significantly south. Our team drew a sector that included the upper portion of the old 267 route and the bench where it connected to the Dark Meadows drainage. I was team leader that day. I had 3 other volunteers with me: a retired school teacher named Gary Pruitt, a young woman named Ava Chen who'd joined SAR less than a year earlier, and a man named Tom Driscoll, who'd been doing this almost as long as I had. We staged at the Forest Road 2329 spur at 0630 and started up the old tread. The lower section was familiar to me. The 2 stream crossings were running higher than I'd seen them before. It had been a wet fall, but nothing dangerous. The trail, such as it was, had deteriorated further since the previous year. In several places, the tread had been completely reclaimed by salal and huckleberry. We were navigating by GPS and occasional old blazes on trees that the Forest Service had never removed. At approximately 0845, we reached the area where Denise and I had turned around the previous year. I recognized the terrain. A slight bench in the drainage where the stream makes a hard left turn around a basalt outcrop. The second-growth fir gives way to an older stand above that pointed trees that were probably too small to log in the 1950s, but had since grown into mature timber. The canopy closes in. The understory shifts from salal to sword fern and Oregon grape with a heavier moss layer. Gary was behind me. He asked if we were still on the trail. I told him we were following the GPS track of the old tread. He nodded and kept walking. About 300 yards past the bench, Ava stopped. She didn't say anything at first. She just stopped walking. I was ahead of her by maybe 40 feet and turned back when I didn't hear her footsteps. She was standing with her trekking poles planted, looking up into the canopy. I asked if she was okay. She said yes. Then she said, "Do you hear that?" I listened. Tom and Gary stopped too. The 4 of us stood there for maybe 30 seconds. I heard the creek below us. I heard wind in the upper canopy. I heard a Steller's jay somewhere to the northeast. I told her I didn't hear anything unusual. She said it was more of a feeling in her ears than a sound. Like pressure, like descending in an airplane. She moved her jaw back and forth, the way you do to pop your ears, and said it didn't help. Tom said he didn't feel anything. Gary said the same. I didn't feel it either. But I watched Ava's face, and she wasn't performing. She wasn't scared. She was puzzled. She was a graduate student in environmental science at the University of Washington. And puzzled was her default setting. She approached everything as a question. I told her to let me know if it got worse, and we kept moving. Over the next 40 minutes, we gained the ridge and reached the bench where the old 267 tread had intersected a use path leading toward Dark Meadows. The intersection was almost impossible to identify on the ground. What had once been a junction was now just a slightly less dense patch of forest where the canopy opened because the soil was compacted from decades of foot traffic. The only physical evidence that humans had ever built anything here was a single rusted bolt, probably from a trail sign, embedded in a Douglas fir about 5 feet off the ground. We searched the bench and the surrounding timber for 2 hours. We found no sign of the missing backpacker. No gear, no tracks, no flagging, no disturbance. This wasn't surprising. The bench was outside the highest probability zone. And solo backpackers who go overdue on the boundary trail almost always turn up somewhere along the main corridor or in one of the established drainages to the north. What I noticed during those 2 hours, and what I did not report, was my own behavior. I need to explain this carefully because it's the part that matters, and it's the part I've spent years trying to understand. I am not someone who gets uncomfortable in the woods. I've done this for over a decade. I've searched in rain, in snow, in darkness. I've found deceased subjects in conditions I won't describe. I've walked through blowdown fields so thick I had to crawl on my hands and knees for a quarter mile. Discomfort in the backcountry is just information to me. It tells you about the terrain, the weather, your physical condition, and your preparation. I process it and move on. On that bench, I could not process it. I didn't hear what Ava heard. I didn't feel pressure in my ears. What I felt was a persistent, low-grade conviction that I should not be there. Not that I was in danger. Not that something was watching me. Nothing that clean or narratable. Just a flat, quiet certainty that I was in a place where I was not supposed to be. In the same way you might feel standing in someone's house when they haven't invited you. A sense of trespass. I have never felt that before or since. I've thought about it enough to know that description is as accurate as I can make it. I didn't say anything. I was the team leader. My job was to complete the assigned search of our sector and report our findings. I did that. We worked the bench grid, found nothing, marked our tracks, and radioed our results at 11:30. The coordinator reassigned us to a sector 2 miles north. We hiked out. The missing backpacker was found the next day by a different team, about 6 miles east of our position, off-trail in a drainage below Tongue Mountain. He'd taken a wrong turn in fog, slipped on a wet log crossing, and broken his ankle. He'd crawled to a creek and waited. He was hypothermic, but alive. Good outcome. After the debrief, I drove home. I ate dinner. I sat in my living room and thought about what had happened on that bench, and I decided it was fatigue. I'd had a 5-hour sleep the night before the call-out. Fatigue produces emotional responses that feel meaningful but aren't. I was a hardware store employee who volunteered for search and rescue, not a mystic. I let it go. Except I noticed something the following spring. The 2018 SAR season in Lewis County was busy. We had 9 call-outs between April and September in areas that overlapped or bordered the drainage where Trail 267 used to run. Mushroom pickers, day hikers, a pair of trail runners who misjudged their route. Standard work. On 3 of those 9 call-outs, the search coordinator's sector assignments routed teams through or near the old 267 corridor. On all 3 occasions, the teams that drew those sectors completed their searches without incident. But on all 3 occasions, the teams finished their grid work faster than their assigned time window. They came back to staging early. Their after-action reports listed no anomalies. Their tracks, when I looked at them on the mapping software we use, showed something subtle. They didn't go up to the bench. The grid assignments clearly included the bench area. The elevation contours were within the assigned sector. But in each case, the teams had worked the lower drainage, swept the mid-slope timber, and then curved their track lines north or east before reaching the point where the old tread gained the ridge. They hadn't violated their assignments in any way that a coordinator would question the bench was at the far edge of each sector. And if you were going to cut a corner for time or energy, that's the corner you'd cut. It was rational. It was defensible. But I noticed it because I'd done the same thing. The day after the October 2017 search, I would have told you my team thoroughly searched the bench. And we did. But looking at our GPS tracks in the mapping software, I could see that our grid on the bench was the loosest, most abbreviated work we did all day. We'd spent 2 hours up there and covered less ground than we had in the drainage below in 45 minutes. We'd walked to the bench, paced around it, and left. Our interval spacing was twice what it should have been. If the missing backpacker had been lying in the ferns 50 feet off our track, we might not have found him. I hadn't done that consciously. I was certain of it. I'd been working the grid the way I always worked grids. But the data said otherwise. I want to be honest about what I did next, because this is where I start to look bad. And it's the reason I'm telling this story instead of keeping it to myself. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't tell the search coordinator. I didn't tell the Lewis County SAR leadership. I didn't bring it up at training. I didn't mention it to Tom or Gary or Ava. I didn't contact the Forest Service. I looked at the data, I saw the pattern, and I kept it to myself. My reasoning at the time was simple. I didn't have an explanation. If I brought GPS tracks to a SAR meeting and said, "It looks like multiple teams are unconsciously avoiding the upper section of a decommissioned trail," the first question would be why. And I didn't have an answer. The second question would be whether it affected any search outcomes, and the answer was no. None of the subjects in those searches had been anywhere near the bench. The third question, which no one would ask out loud but everyone would think, was whether I was the kind of person who believed in that sort of thing. And in SAR, credibility is everything. Credibility is what keeps coordinators assigning you to critical sectors. Credibility is what makes team members trust your judgment when you say a drainage is safe to descend or a slope is too unstable to traverse. I wasn't going to spend mine on something I couldn't explain, so I kept it. And here is the part where keeping it became a problem. In September 2019, we got a call out for a missing day hiker. Female, 26 years old, hiking alone. She'd told her roommate she was going to Blue Lake, which is about 3 miles north of the old 267 drainage. She didn't come back. Her car was found at the Blue Lake Creek trailhead. The search began on a Tuesday morning. I was at work when the call-out came. I left the store my boss has always been understanding about SAR and drove to the staging area at the Iron Creek campground. The coordinator was a deputy named Paul Reinhardt, who I'd worked with on probably 20 searches. Good guy, calm, methodical, trusted the volunteers. Paul briefed us at 0800. The subject had no wilderness experience to speak of. She'd been seen by another hiker on the Blue Lake Trail at approximately 1400 the previous day, heading south, which was the wrong direction if she was trying to reach Blue Lake. The working theory was that she'd missed a junction and ended up in one of the drainages below the ridge. He divided the search area into 12 sectors. My team, me, Tom Driscoll, and a newer volunteer named Rich Hooper drew Sector 7, which covered the drainage immediately west of the old 267 tread. I looked at the map on Paul's table. Sector 7 came within a quarter mile of the bench. Sector 8, adjacent to ours, included it. I asked Paul who had Sector 8. He said a team from the Packwood unit. I could have said something then. I could have said, "I've noticed teams tend to cut their coverage short up near that bench. You might want to flag it." I could have offered it as a practical observation without any mystical context. Paul would have listened. He might have assigned additional coverage, or he might have noted it and moved on. Either way, I would have done the responsible thing. I didn't say it. I told myself it wasn't relevant. The subject had been heading south from Blue Lake, and the bench was southwest, at the far edge of the search area. Low probability. I told myself I was being rational. What I was being was afraid, not of the bench. Afraid of sounding like the kind of person who avoids parts of the forest for reasons he can't articulate. Afraid of being that volunteer, the one the coordinators stop assigning to serious sectors, the one people talk about in the parking lot after debriefs. My team worked Sector 7 from 0900 to 1500. We found nothing. The Packwood team worked Sector 8. They found nothing. They came back 20 minutes early. I looked at their tracks later. They didn't go up to the bench. The subject was found on Wednesday morning by a helicopter crew. She was in a creek bed about 1.5 miles south of Blue Lake, with a broken wrist and moderate hypothermia. She'd fallen off a log bridge in the dark, spent the night in the creek drainage, and hadn't been able to climb out. She was conscious when they reached her and made a full recovery. She was nowhere near Sector 7 or 8. She was nowhere near the bench. My silence didn't matter. Except it did matter, because it taught me something about myself that I didn't like. I had professional obligations to my team and to the people we search for. And when those obligations required me to share something uncomfortable, I chose my reputation instead. That's not the kind of person I'd thought I was. It's not the kind of volunteer I'd trained to be. And the problem was that I still didn't have anything concrete to share. I had feelings. I had GPS tracks that showed a subtle pattern. I had Denise saying one word wrong 3 years earlier. And I had my own experience on the bench, which I couldn't separate from how tired I'd been that day. So I carried it. Through the rest of 2019, through 2020 when COVID cut our call-outs in half, through 2021 when things picked back up and I walked more miles in the Gifford Pin Show than any year previous. I carried it like a small debt I kept meaning to pay, but never did. And the longer I carried it, the harder it became to put down. Because putting it down meant explaining why I'd picked it up in the first place, and then held on to it for years. In the spring of 2022, Ava Chen finished her graduate work and moved to Bend, Oregon. Before she left, we had coffee in Randall, and she asked me if I remembered the search in October 2017, the one where we'd gone up to the bench on the old 267 tread. I said I did. She asked if I'd ever felt anything like that again. She said it carefully. She wasn't trying to sound dramatic. She was asking the way a scientist asks a question open-ended, looking for data. I told her no, which was true. I had not gone back to the bench. She nodded. Then she said something that changed the shape of what I'd been carrying. She said that after that search, she'd gone back on her own. Twice. Once in the spring of 2018 and once in the fall. She said that both times, the pressure sensation in her ears returned in the same location, about 300 yards above the bench in the drainage, near the transition from second growth to older timber. She said she'd brought an audio recorder the second time, a field recorder she used for environmental monitoring in her graduate work. She said the recorder picked up nothing unusual in the audible range, but she'd run the file through a spectrogram, and there was a consistent low-frequency signal below 20 hertz. Infrasound. Strong enough to show on the spectrogram, but not strong enough to identify a source. I asked her what could produce infrasound in a forest drainage. She said wind moving through a particular geological formation, certain underground water flows through karst, seismic micro-tremors, or industrial equipment at a distance. She said she'd checked the nearest industrial sources. The closest was a timber operation 12 miles west, and cross-referenced the dates of her visits with USGS seismic data for the area. No correlation. She hadn't investigated further because she'd moved on to other work. But she said the signal was real, and she couldn't explain it. Then she said something else. She said that on her second visit, the one with the recorder, she'd noticed a game trail that crossed the old 267 tread just below the bench. It was well worn, deep, the kind of trail that elk or deer use consistently over many years. But it went to the bench and then stopped. Not stopped like it petered out. Stopped like it reached a line, and animals turned around. She'd walked the bench herself. There was no game trail crossing it, no scat, no browse, no bed-down sites. The bench, maybe 200 yards long and 60 wide, a relatively flat, sheltered area in the forest with water nearby, had none of the wildlife sign that you'd expect in that kind of habitat. I sat across from her in the coffee shop and understood that she was describing, with scientific precision, the same thing I'd felt and failed to say. Something about that bench discouraged presence. Not violently, not dangerously, but consistently. Animals turned around. Search teams loosened their grids. Experienced volunteers said the drainage felt wrong. And I'd known for years and said nothing. Ava didn't accuse me of anything. She didn't know I'd been carrying this. She was just sharing her data before she left the area. The way a good scientist makes sure observations don't die with a move. She gave me a copy of the spectrogram on a flash drive. She said if I ever wanted to follow up, the data was mine. I thanked her. She left. I put the flash drive in my glove box and didn't look at it for 4 months. What happened in August 2022 is the part of this story I've never told anyone, except my wife. And my wife, who is more honest than I am about most things, is the reason I'm telling it now. In August 2022, Lewis County SAR received a call-out that was different from the others. Not in kind, it was still a missing person in the Gifford Pinchot, but in detail. The subject was a 72-year-old man named Carl Mettler, retired machinist from Centralia. He'd driven up Forest Road 23 on a Saturday morning, parked at a pullout about a mile south of the Cispus River Bridge, and walked into the forest. His wife reported him missing Sunday evening when he didn't come home. She told the deputy that Carl had been going to that same pullout every few weeks for the past 2 years. She said he went to walk and think. She said he never went far. She also said he always came back quiet. The deputy asked what she meant. She said Carl wasn't a quiet person. He talked constantly at home, at the store, in the truck. But after his drives up Forest Road 23, he'd come home and not speak for hours. She'd asked him about it once, and he'd said the forest was good for clearing his head. She hadn't pressed it. I heard all this during Paul Reinhardt's morning briefing. 16 volunteers staged at the same Iron Creek campground. Standard deployment. My team, Tom Driscoll, Rich Hooper, and me, drew Sector 5. I looked at the map and felt the debt I'd been carrying shift its weight. Sector 5 was the old 267 drainage. All of it. Lower crossings, mid-slope timber, and the bench. Carl Mettler's pullout was less than a mile from the old trailhead spur on Forest Road 2329. If he'd walked south from his vehicle and followed any of the remaining fragments of the old tread, the bench was exactly the kind of destination a 72-year-old man could reach on a day walk. Moderate grade, reasonable distance, sheltered. I looked at the map for a long time. Tom was beside me eating a granola bar. Rich was adjusting his pack straps. I said to Paul, "We should expect to reach the upper bench in this sector. I want to make sure we have enough daylight to grid it thoroughly." Paul nodded. He said, "Take the time you need." That was it. That was all I could bring myself to say. Not, "I've noticed teams don't search this area well." Not, "There's something about this bench I think you should know." Just a soft request for enough time. The smallest possible version of doing the right thing. We left staging at 07:15 and walked in along the remnant of the 267 tread. I'd pulled up Ava's spectrogram data the night before on my home computer. I'd stared at the low frequency band below 20 Hertz and tried to understand what it meant. I couldn't. I'm not a scientist. What I could understand was the map her GPS points overlaid on the terrain, showing where the signal appeared and where the game trail ended. Both converged on the bench. The morning was overcast. Thin cloud deck, no rain, temperature in the low 50s. Typical early August in the southern Cascades when the marine layer pushes in. The lower drainage was wet. The creek crossings were manageable, but the second one required careful footing on mossy rocks. Tom went across first, then Rich, then me. We worked uphill methodically. This was a missing person search, not a body recovery. Carl had been gone less than 48 hours, and his wife said he was in good health for his age. We were calling his name at intervals, listening for a response, checking the drainage for any sign of travel. At approximately 09:30, Rich stopped and pointed to something off the old tread, maybe 15 feet into the understory. A faded piece of orange flagging tape tied around a huckleberry branch about waist height. I walked over and looked at it. The tape was old. The color had bleached from exposure, and the knot was tight and weathered. It wasn't survey flagging, it was the cheap stuff you buy at a hardware store. I sell it. I know the brands. This was the kind a hunter or hiker might carry to mark a route. Tom said it could be from anything. He was right. People flag routes in the backcountry all the time, especially on unmaintained trails. It didn't mean Carl Mettler had been there. But I noticed something else about it. The flagging was tied so that it was visible from downhill from the direction we'd come, but not from uphill. If you were walking up the drainage, you'd see it. If you were walking down, you'd pass right by it. It was a breadcrumb, not a waypoint. Someone had marked a route in, not a route out. We kept going. Over the next quarter mile, we found 3 more pieces of the same faded orange tape. Each one was tied on the uphill-facing side of a branch or small tree. Each one was at roughly the same height. They led in a gentle ascending line toward the bench. This was a well-established route someone had flagged years ago. A personal route. We reached the bench at 10:45. I want to describe it as precisely as I can, because what we found there is what everything else in this story is about. The bench is a natural terrace in the drainage, formed where a harder layer of basalt resisted the erosion that carved the creek valley on either side. It's roughly 200 yards long and maybe 60 to 80 yards wide at its broadest point, oriented northeast to southwest. The slope above it is moderate. The slope below drops more steeply toward the creek. The timber on the bench is mature Douglas fir and western hemlock, with some western red cedar along the wetter margins. The canopy is dense. The understory is sword fern, Oregon grape, and moss. Deep moss. The kind that grows on everything: logs, rocks, the root flares of standing trees, the ground itself. Walking on it is like walking on a sponge. Ava had been right about the wildlife sign. There was none. No elk scat, no deer pellets, no browse, no rub marks on trees, no tracks in the soft soil near the seeps along the upper margin. I've spent enough time in the Gifford Pinchot to know what a healthy forest bench should look like in terms of animal use. This one looked unused. It looked like a place animals knew about and chose not to occupy. I didn't feel the pressure Ava had described. What I felt was the same thing I'd felt in 2017. That quiet sense of trespass, of being in a room I hadn't been invited into. Tom was 20 yards to my left. He was scanning the bench with the calm, focused expression he always wore during searches. Rich was behind me, marking waypoints on his GPS. Neither of them appeared to be feeling anything unusual. I called Carl Mettler's name. The sound died quickly. The moss and the canopy absorbed it the way a recording studio absorbs sound. There was no echo, no carry. I called again, louder. Same result. We began gridding the bench. Standard interval, 15 to 20 feet between searchers, walking parallel lines from the northeast end to the southwest end. On the second pass, Rich found a boot print. It was in a patch of exposed mineral soil near a small seep, where water had washed the moss and duff away. A single clear print, maybe 10 inches long, lug sole, hiking boot. Recent, the edges were sharp, and the soil at the bottom of the print still held moisture. I photographed it with my phone and marked the coordinates. We expanded our search around the area. 30 feet southwest of the print, Tom found something else. A small clearing, maybe 8 feet in diameter, where the moss had been disturbed. Not torn up, compressed, flattened in a roughly circular pattern, as if someone had sat or lain in the same spot repeatedly over a long period. The moss at the edges of the clearing was green and alive. The moss in the center was brown and dead, crushed past its ability to recover. In the middle of the compressed area, there was a rock. Not a natural rock, or rather, it was a natural rock. A piece of rounded basalt about the size of a cantaloupe. But it had been placed there, set on top of the flattened moss. There was nothing under it. No note, no cache, no marker. Just a rock, placed with obvious intention in the center of a space that someone had been visiting for long enough to kill the moss beneath them. I picked up the rock. It was heavy, cold. Under it, the moss was completely dead, compressed into a thin, dark mat. I set the rock back down, exactly where it had been. Tom looked at me. I looked at him. "Someone's been coming here," he said. I nodded. "A lot," he said. I nodded again. We expanded the search to cover the entire bench. We found no other boot prints. We found no other disturbances. But near the southwest end of the bench, where the terrace narrows and the slope steepens toward the creek, Rich found the last piece of orange flagging tape. It was tied to a low branch of a hemlock facing downhill, and it was fresher than the others, less faded, more recent. Below it, a faint path descended toward the creek through sword fern that had been brushed aside enough times to create a visible gap. Not a trail, a rote. A line that someone had walked often enough to leave a mark, but not often enough to kill the vegetation. I followed it. Tom called after me to be careful. The slope was steep and wet. I braced my trekking poles and descended about 40 yards to where the path leveled out at a small gravel bar beside the creek. Carl Mettler was sitting on the gravel bar with his back against a moss-covered boulder. He was alive. He was conscious. He was wearing a rain jacket and hiking boots and had a small day pack beside him. He looked up at me with an expression I can only describe as resigned. Not relieved, not frightened. Resigned the way a person looks when they've been expecting something to end, and it finally has. I radioed it in. Subject located, conscious and ambulatory. Sector 5, lower bench drainage. I gave the coordinates. Paul acknowledged. Medical team would stage at the nearest road access point, and we'd walk Carl out. I sat down beside him on the gravel bar and asked the standard questions. Was he hurt? No. Was he having chest pain, difficulty breathing, dizziness? No. Had he fallen? No. Did he know what day it was? He did. He knew he'd been out for 2 nights. He had water. The creek was right there, but no food and no shelter beyond his rain jacket. I asked him why he hadn't walked out. He didn't answer right away. He looked at the creek. Then he looked up the slope toward the bench, which was invisible from where we sat, but present in a way I could feel, the way you feel a room above you when you're standing in a basement. He said, "I wasn't ready." I asked him what he meant. He said he'd been coming to this spot for 2 years, every few weeks, like his wife had said. He'd found the bench by accident in 2020 during one of his walks off Forest Road 23. He'd followed the old trail fragments. He'd flagged the route with orange tape so he could find it again. He'd found the place on the bench, the compressed clearing, the rock, and he'd started sitting there. I asked what happened when he sat there. He looked at me for a long time. He had pale blue eyes, very clear for a man his age, and they were doing something I recognized because I'd felt it in myself. He was calculating whether to tell me the truth. He said, "It's quiet." I said the whole forest was quiet. He shook his head. "Not like this. You've been up there, you know." I didn't respond. I should have. A normal SAR volunteer, one who hadn't been carrying what I'd been carrying for 5 years, would have said something neutral and professional. "Of course, sir. Let's focus on getting you out." They would have kept the subject talking, kept him comfortable, and saved the questions for the debrief. But I looked at Carl Mettler sitting on that gravel bar, a 72-year-old retired machinist who'd been driving an hour each way to sit in a patch of dead moss in a forest with no animals in it. And I wanted to know. I said, "I know." He studied my face. Whatever he saw there was apparently enough. He said that when he sat in that spot on the bench, his mind went completely still. Not calm still. No thoughts, no internal narration, no noise at all. He said it was like someone had turned off a machine that had been running his entire life, and he'd never known it was on until it stopped. He said it was the most frightening thing he'd ever experienced. And he kept going back, because after a while, the fear wore off. And what was left underneath was something he didn't have a word for. He said the last time he came Saturday morning, the visit that turned into a missing person call-out, he'd sat down on the bench, and the stillness had been deeper than it had ever been. So deep that he hadn't wanted to leave. He hadn't meant to stay overnight. He'd just lost the desire to stand up. When it got dark, he'd walked down to the creek because he was thirsty, and then he'd sat on the gravel bar and let the night pass. And then another day, and then another night. He said he could have walked out at any time. His body worked fine. He simply hadn't wanted to. He said he knew how that sounded. I told him it didn't matter how it sounded. I told him we needed to get him out and get him checked by medical. And whatever was happening on the bench, it wasn't safe for a 72-year-old man to spend 2 nights outside without food or shelter. Me agreed. He stood up without assistance, shouldered his pack, and climbed the slope back to the bench with more steadiness than I would have expected. When we crossed the bench, he didn't look at the compressed clearing. He walked past it with his eyes forward, and his pace was brisk, the quickest he'd moved since I found him. Tom and Rich flanked him. I followed. We walked out along the old 267 tread. We reached Forest Road, 2329. Medical assessed him at the staging area. Moderate dehydration, mild hypothermia, no injuries. They transported him to the hospital in Morton as a precaution. He was released that evening. Paul Reinhardt pulled me aside during the debrief. He asked about Carl's mental state at the time I'd located him. I said the subject was oriented and coherent, but appeared reluctant to leave the area. Paul nodded and wrote something in his notes. He didn't ask me to elaborate. I drove home that night with Ava's flash drive still in my glove box, and a rock sitting in the center of a dead patch of moss somewhere above me on the ridge. For the next several weeks, I thought about Carl Mettler every day. I thought about the compressed clearing. I thought about the flagging tape he'd tied facing uphill, and the boot print, and the absence of wildlife, and the infrasound on Ava's spectrogram. I thought about Denise Kowalski saying the drainage felt wrong. And I thought about all the GPS tracks curving away from the bench like water flowing around a stone in a creek. I did not go back to the bench. I want to be clear about that because it's important for what comes next. I did not go back. The pattern of my own behavior, the same pattern I'd seen in other teams, the same pattern Carl Mettler had described from the opposite direction, was that I avoided the bench. Not out of fear, out of the same thing I'd felt every time I was up there, a sense that I was not invited. But I did do one thing. In October 2022, I pulled Ava's spectrogram data off the flash drive and emailed it to a geology professor at Central Washington University in Ellensburg. I didn't explain the context. I said I was a SAR volunteer in Lewis County and had recorded some anomalous low-frequency data in a drainage in the Gifford Pinchot. And I wondered if there was a geological explanation. He wrote back a week later. He said the signal was interesting, but not unprecedented. Infrasound in forested drainages could be produced by several mechanisms. The most common in the Cascades was wind interacting with specific topographic features, ridge gaps, narrow canyons, tube-like valleys, to create standing waves below the range of human hearing. He said it could also be produced by subsurface water moving through volcanic rock formations, which the southern Gifford Pinchot had in abundance due to its proximity to the Mount Adams and Goat Rocks volcanic systems. He said without a site visit and more data, he couldn't narrow it further. He asked if I could share the location. I said I'd get back to him. I never did. I'm going to describe what happened next in the order it happened, because the order is part of the problem. In January 2023, Denise Kowalski had a stroke. She survived, but she didn't come back to SAR. I visited her at her home in Packwood a few months later. We talked about the old days, the searches we'd done together, the people we'd found, and the ones we hadn't. Near the end of the visit, I asked her about the day in 2016 when she'd stopped on the old 267 tread and said the drainage felt wrong. She remembered immediately. She didn't have to think about it. She said that what she'd felt that day was not fear or discomfort. She said it was grief, a sudden, sourceless grief, as if she'd walked into someone else's sadness. She said it lasted about 30 seconds and then faded. And by the time she'd told me the drainage felt wrong, the feeling was already passing, and she'd felt foolish for stopping. I thanked her. I drove home. In July 2023, I got a call from a woman who identified herself as Carl Mettler's wife, Gloria. She said Carl had given her my name. She said Carl had been diagnosed with early-stage Alzheimer's in the spring, and his driving privileges had been revoked. She said he couldn't go to the forest anymore. Then she said Carl wanted to know if anyone was taking care of his spot. I didn't know what to say. I told her I wasn't sure what she meant. She said Carl had a place in the forest that he went to, and he was worried about it. She said he talked about it more than he talked about almost anything else, and she wanted to understand what it was so she could help him let go of it. I told her the truth. I told her Carl had been found near a bench on a decommissioned trail in the Gifford Pinchot, and that the bench appeared to be a place he'd been visiting regularly. I told her he seemed to find peace there. I didn't tell her about the infrasound, the missing wildlife, or the way search teams avoided the area. I gave her the version that was true and helpful and incomplete. She thanked me. She sounded tired in the particular way that caregivers sound tired, not from a bad night, but from a long, unbroken series of adequate ones. Before she hung up, she said one more thing. She said that in the 2 years Carl had been visiting the forest, he'd been the happiest she'd seen him in decades. She said whatever he'd found out there, it had given him something she couldn't. She said she didn't resent that, but she wanted to understand it. And now he was losing the ability to explain. After she hung up, I sat in my kitchen for a long time. Then I told my wife. All of it. The GPS tracks, Denise, Ava's spectrogram, Carl Mettler on the gravel bar, the feeling on the bench, the years of silence. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "You need to go back." I said I didn't want to. She said, "I know. That's why you need to." In September 2023, I drove up Forest Road 23, turned onto 2329, and parked at the same pullout Carl Mettler had used. I walked the old 267 tread alone. I carried my pack, my GPS, a radio, a field recorder I'd borrowed from a friend, and a handheld weather station that measured temperature, barometric pressure, and humidity. It took me 90 minutes to reach the bench. The orange flagging tape was still there. Faded further, some of it hanging loose where the knots had weathered. The forest was doing its work. In another few years, the flags would be gone. The bench looked the same. Moss, fern, dense canopy, no wildlife sign. The compressed clearing was still there, but the dead moss in the center had been partially recolonized by new growth. The rock was still in place. I turned on the field recorder and the weather station. I set them on a log near the clearing and walked the bench from end to end, slowly, the way I'd walk a search grid. I took my time. I was alone, which was not safe and not smart. And I'd told my wife exactly where I was going and when I expected to be back. The feeling was there. That sense of trespass, of intrusion. It was neither stronger nor weaker than it had been in 2017. It was constant, like a tone you stop noticing until you move and realize it's still there. I sat down in the compressed clearing. I don't know how long I sat. My watch said 40 minutes when I finally checked it, but that number felt wrong in both directions. Too long for how little I'd experienced, and too short for how far away the rest of my life seemed while I was sitting there. Carl was right. The stillness was real. I want to be careful about how I describe this because I'm not a spiritual person. And I don't think what happened on that bench was spiritual. It was physical. It was something in that place, the air, the ground, the frequency Ava recorded. Some combination of factors that produced a physiological effect. My mind slowed down. The constant background hum of thought, grocery lists, work schedules, tomorrow's weather, the argument I'd had with my brother-in-law, the sound of my own internal voice went quiet. Not all at once. It was like a faucet being slowly closed. Over the course of those 40 minutes, the noise reduced to a trickle and then to nothing. And what was underneath was not peace and not emptiness. It was attention. Pure, directionless attention. I was aware of the moss under my hands, the bark of the tree beside me, the exact quality of the gray light coming through the canopy. Every detail was vivid and equal. Nothing was more important than anything else. I understood why Carl had stayed. I understood why he'd gone back every few weeks for 2 years. And I understood why he'd asked his wife if someone was taking care of his spot. Because while I sat there, some part of me wanted to protect it too. Not from harm, from attention, from the kind of well-meaning, curious attention that would bring people with instruments and questions and theories, and turn a place that did something inexplicable into a place that was being explained. I stood up. I collected the recorder and the weather station. I walked off the bench and down the old tread to my truck. At home, I looked at the data. The weather station showed normal readings: temperature, pressure, humidity, all consistent with the conditions. The field recorder had picked up something. I'm not an audio engineer, but I ran the file through the same freeware spectrogram software Ava had told me about. And there it was. The same low-frequency band, steady and consistent, hovering around 14 to 16 hertz, below human hearing. Above the threshold where, according to what I'd read, infrasound can produce physiological effects in some people: unease, pressure in the ears, emotional responses, altered perception of time. That should have been the answer. That should have been enough. A geological feature producing infrasound in a specific drainage, affecting human perception and possibly deterring wildlife, explains every single thing I've described in this story. The feeling of wrongness, the pressure in Ava's ears, Denise's sudden grief, the absence of game, the way search teams unconsciously shorten their time in the area. Carl Mettler's stillness. It's clean. It's rational. It makes complete sense. And it doesn't explain the rock. Not the rock itself. That's just a rock Carl picked up and placed. It's what the rock represents. Carl Mettler didn't find a naturally occurring infrasound zone and experience it passively. He found it, returned to it dozens of times, marked a route to it, established a specific sitting place within it, and placed a stone at the center of that place as if he were tending something. Denise felt grief, not discomfort, not pressure, but grief. Specific, emotional, directional grief. Ava found a line where animals approach and then turn back, as if the boundary of the effect is sharp enough for them to identify and respect. Infrasound doesn't do those things. Infrasound produces generalized unease and vague physiological effects. It doesn't produce grief. It doesn't create a line animals won't cross. It doesn't make a retired machinist drive an hour each way to sit in the same spot for 2 years and then ask someone to take care of it when he can't come anymore. Something else is happening on that bench. Maybe it's infrasound combined with something I haven't measured. Maybe it's a geological phenomenon that produces effects we haven't studied yet. Maybe the explanation is entirely physical, and I just don't have enough data. That's the most likely answer, and it's the one I lean toward on days when I'm thinking clearly. But there are other days. Days when I remember the 40 minutes I spent sitting in Carl's spot and the quality of the stillness, and how it felt less like a sound affecting my brain, and more like a place where something in the landscape was paying attention back. I haven't gone back since September 2023. I haven't shared the spectrogram data with the geology professor. I haven't told the SAR coordinator. I haven't filed anything with the Forest Service. I haven't contacted Ava, though I still have her email. My wife asks me about it sometimes. She asks with the careful patience of someone who knows I'm not done with this, but also knows I can't be pushed. She said something last month that I haven't been able to shake. She said, "You spent 5 years not telling anyone about a place because you were protecting your reputation. Now you're not telling anyone because you're protecting the place." Those are different things, but the silence looks the same. She's right. I know she's right. But I also know that every person who has encountered that bench, Denise, Ava, Carl, the search teams who drift away from it without knowing why, and me, has arrived at the same response. Leave it alone. Not because we agreed to, not because we discussed it, because the bench asks for it in some way that none of us can describe and all of us can feel. I'm a hardware store employee who volunteers for search and rescue. I'm not equipped to determine whether a place in the forest can ask for something. I'm not even sure that's a meaningful sentence. What I am equipped to do is notice when multiple independent observers converge on the same behavior without coordination, and call that a pattern worth respecting, even if I can't name what's driving it. The bench is still there. The old 267 tread is still disappearing. The orange flags are probably gone by now. The rock is probably still sitting on its dead patch of moss, though the moss is growing back and will eventually swallow it. The infrasound is presumably still cycling through the drainage at 14 hertz, doing whatever it does to whoever walks into its range. And somewhere in Centralia, Carl Mettler is losing his memories one by one. And I wonder sometimes whether the last one he'll lose, the one buried deepest, held tightest, is the way it felt to sit in that clearing and have the noise finally stop. And whether the bench remembers him the way he remembers it. That's not a question I can answer. It's not a question I should be asking. I sell lag bolts and PVC fittings and give advice about deck stain. And on weekends, I help find people who are lost in the woods. And one of those people found something in the woods that I can measure but cannot explain. And the most honest thing I've ever done is admit that I don't know what to do with that. If the Lewis County SAR coordinator is listening to this, and Paul, if you are, I'm sorry I should have told you about the GPS tracks years ago. It probably doesn't matter operationally. No subject has ever been found on or near that bench. But it was your data and your team's, and I didn't share it because I was afraid of what it would make me look like. That was wrong, and I own it. If Ava Chen is listening, your data was good. You measured something real. I hope you do something with it someday, even if I couldn't. And if Carl's wife Gloria is listening, I want you to know that yes, someone is taking care of it. Not me exactly. The forest is taking care of it. The moss and the ferns and the hemlock are slowly reclaiming the clearing and the tread and the flags. And in a few more years, there won't be a visible path to the bench at all. And whatever is there will go back to being what it was before Carl found it. And before I found Carl. A place in the woods that asks to be left alone, surrounded by people and animals who have been listening without knowing it. I don't know what that means. I'm only describing what I found.